My name is Charlotte. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've occupied roles that are easy to underestimate. Wife, professional support staff, the stable one, the person who remembers birthdays and renews insurance policies without being asked. I've lived in that quiet middle space where nothing looks dramatic from the outside, and that's usually where people stop looking. If you met me before all of this happened, you probably would have described me as calm. Maybe too calm, organized, polite. Someone who doesn't raise her voice, doesn't make scenes, doesn't demand attention. I've been mistaken for passive more times than I can count, as if silence automatically means absence of thought, as if not reacting is the same as not noticing. This story isn't about a single explosive moment. It's not about revenge, or winning, or proving anyone wrong in the way movies like to show it. It's about what happens slowly, when you are misread for long enough that other people start making decisions on your behalf, confident that you won't object, or that if you do, it won't matter. I want to be clear about something from the start. I'm not here to dramatize my life or turn real people into villains. I'm not here to shout, expose secrets for entertainment, or invite you to take sides. What I'm sharing is a record of how quiet power works, how it forms, how it's ignored, and how it eventually changes the direction of a life without ever raising its voice. The emotional journey of this story moves slowly on purpose. It begins with being seen as harmless, then useful, then invisible. It passes through moments that seemed small at the time, comments brushed off, decisions made for my own good, concern that didn't feel like care once you looked closely. And it ends not with punishment, but with clarity, with the kind of ending that doesn't look dramatic from the outside, but feels irreversible once you're inside it. There are parts of this story that are uncomfortable to sit with, especially if you've ever trusted someone to speak for you, especially if you've ever stayed quiet because it seemed easier, or kinder, or safer. I won't embellish those moments. I won't soften them either. I promised myself when I decided to tell this that I would choose honesty over spectacle. You'll hear about a marriage, about professionals who believed they understood me better than I understood myself, about a moment when concern crossed an invisible line and became control, and about the kind of preparation that happens not in anger, but in silence. If you're expecting a dramatic confession or a shocking twist right away, this may not be that kind of story. But if you're interested in how people lose power without noticing, and how it can be reclaimed without cruelty, then stay with me. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something gently and without expectation. Have you ever had a moment where you realized that people had been deciding who you were without ever asking you? Before anything fractured, before words like intervention or evaluation entered my life, I was someone people relied on without really seeing. I didn't stand out in rooms, I blended. And for a long time, that felt like a kind of success. To my spouse, I was the steady one. The person who didn't panic, didn't spiral, didn't need reassurance every 5 minutes. When something went wrong, I adjusted. When plans changed, I adapted. That trait, my ability to remain composed, became my defining feature in our relationship, but not in the way I understood it. It slowly stopped being a strength and started being an expectation. Friends describe me as grounded, low maintenance, easy to be around. The compliment usually came paired with an assumption that I didn't need much, that I didn't require checking in or asking twice or circling back to see how I was really doing. I became the person others leaned against, not the one they worried might fall. At work, I was competent and dependable. I handled details others overlooked. I remembered conversations people forgot they'd had. I noticed patterns long before they became problems. But because I didn't announce these things loudly, my presence faded into the background. I was trusted with responsibility, not authority, with execution, not credit. No one ever said, "Charlotte doesn't matter." That's not how it works. It was subtler than that. Decisions were made around me, not against me. Plans were discussed as if my agreement was a given. When I expressed discomfort, it was reframed as stress. When I disagreed, it was softened into concern, mine, not theirs. I learned early on that reacting emotionally made people uncomfortable, so I didn't. I learned that asking too many questions slowed things down, so I listened instead. Over time, that restraint was misinterpreted as emptiness, as if the quiet space I kept around myself meant there was nothing inside it. My spouse would sometimes speak about me while I was sitting right there. "She's fine with it," he'd say, casually. "She doesn't mind," he'd add, confidently. And because I didn't correct him every time, the version of me he narrated became more real to others than the one I actually inhabited. I wasn't unhappy in the obvious ways. There were no shouting matches, no dramatic ultimatums. Our home functioned smoothly. Bills were paid, schedules aligned. From the outside, we looked like a couple who had figured things out, who had bypassed the messier stages of conflict and arrived at something mature. But maturity, I learned, can sometimes be another word for silence that's gone unquestioned for too long. The more capable I appeared, the fewer people checked whether I wanted the things I was handling. And the less I protested, the more my silence was used as evidence of consent. I became predictable, reliable, interchangeable with the role I played. There were moments, small, almost forgettable ones, when I felt myself receding, when a choice was framed as already decided, when my input was summarized instead of quoted, when concern sounded suspiciously like supervision. Still, I didn't push back. Not because I was afraid, but because nothing felt urgent enough yet. I told myself this was what partnership looked like. That compromise meant letting some things go, that being the stable one required absorbing discomfort quietly so others wouldn't have to. What I didn't realize then was that stability, when misread, becomes permission. Permission to assume. Permission to override. Permission to speak for someone instead of listening to them. And once people grow used to that permission, they rarely ask if it's still being given. At that stage of my life, I was not seen as someone who might one day resist. I was seen as someone who would endure. Someone whose silence meant agreement. Someone whose calm could be interpreted, reshaped, and eventually used. That was who I was to them, and it mattered more than I understood at the time. The first moment didn't arrive with warning. It didn't feel important enough to remember at the time, which is probably why it lasted. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, one of those days that blur together later. My spouse and I were sitting at the kitchen table, laptops open, half working, half talking. He mentioned a conversation he'd had with a colleague about stress, about how everyone our age is burned out in some way. I nodded, distracted, not thinking much of it. Then he said lightly, almost affectionately, "I told him you've been having a rough time lately." I looked up, not sharply, just enough to register surprise. "I have?" I asked. He didn't pause. "You know, you've been quieter, a little withdrawn." It wasn't accusatory. That's important. His tone was gentle, concerned even, the kind of concern that sounds reasonable enough to accept without argument. I remember feeling an instinctive flicker, something between confusion and discomfort, but it passed quickly. "I'm fine," I said, "just busy up on samba." He smiled, the way people do when they think they understand you better than you understand yourself. "That's what you always say." That was the cut. Small, clean, almost surgical. In isolation, it meant nothing. Couples misinterpret each other all the time. I could have corrected him more firmly. I could have asked why he felt entitled to narrate my internal state to someone else. I didn't. Not because I agreed, but because I didn't want to turn a casual moment into a debate. It felt easier to let it slide. And everyone else did too. Later, when we met friends for dinner, the comment resurfaced in a different form. Someone asked how I was doing, with that vague seriousness people use when they think they're being considerate. Before I could answer, my spouse said, "She's been under a lot of pressure lately, but she's managing." Managing. The word landed strangely. It wasn't wrong enough to challenge outright, but it wasn't right either. It compressed my experience into something smaller, flatter, easier to digest. I noticed how the conversation moved on immediately after that, as if the question had been answered sufficiently, as if my presence was no longer required. I smiled, I nodded, I let it go. That night, I lay awake longer than usual, replaying the exchanges. Not obsessively, just enough to feel the outline of something off. I told myself I was being sensitive, that I should be grateful for a partner who noticed changes, who expressed concern, who spoke up. But concern, I realized, had started arriving without verification. No one asked me if the description fit. No one checked whether quiet meant contentment, focus, or simply rest. The assumption slid neatly into place, unchallenged, and because I didn't object loudly, it stayed there. Over the next few weeks, similar moments accumulated. A suggestion that I take it easy when I declined an invitation. A comment about me being overwhelmed when I forgot to respond to a message quickly. A casual mention, overheard, that I might be pushing myself too hard. Each one was delivered with kindness. That was the most disarming part. There was no malice to react against, no clear offense to point to. Just a growing narrative forming around me, told in my absence and occasionally in my presence, as if I were a character whose arc others had already mapped out. I tried gently to correct it once. "I'm actually okay," I said one evening, when my spouse suggested I cancel a plan to rest. "I just didn't feel like talking much today." He looked relieved. Not convinced. "That's exactly what I mean." I didn't push further. I didn't know how to explain that choosing quiet wasn't the same as struggling. That solitude wasn't a symptom. That calm didn't require interpretation. What unsettled me most wasn't the misreading itself. It was how easily it was accepted by everyone else. Friends, colleagues, even extended family began responding to me with a carefulness I hadn't asked for. Their voices softened. Their questions became indirect, as if I were fragile in a way I hadn't noticed becoming. And each time, I faced a choice: correct them and risk seeming defensive, or stay quiet and preserve the peace. I chose peace, repeatedly. At the time, it felt like maturity, like patience, like choosing my battles wisely. Only later did I understand that this was how authority shifts, not in one dramatic seizure, but in a series of small, unchallenged edits to who you are allowed to be. That first small cut didn't bleed, but it marked where the incision would deepen. Once the story about me existed, it didn't need to be defended, it only needed to be repeated. That's how it settled into normalcy. At first, I noticed it in how people spoke to me. Conversations slowed, as if I needed extra time to process. Opinions were delivered carefully, pre-softened, like bad news. When I disagreed, the response wasn't argument, it was reassurance. "You don't have to worry about that right now. Let's not overwhelm you. Just focus on taking care of yourself." None of these statements were hostile. That's what made them difficult to challenge. They carried the tone of protection, not dismissal. And yet, each one placed me a step further away from equal footing. I began to recognize a pattern. My perspective was still welcomed, but no longer decisive. Input without influence. Presence without agency. At home, this shift became subtle, but consistent. Plans were made with phrases like, "I figured this would be easier for you," or "I didn't want to add more to your plate." Sometimes I agreed, sometimes I didn't. Either way, the outcome rarely changed. When I pointed out that I hadn't been consulted, the response was immediate and calm. I was just trying to help. And because help is hard to argue with, the conversation usually ended there. I started second-guessing my reactions. Was I being ungrateful, defensive, too sensitive? I replayed interactions in my head, searching for evidence that I was overreacting. I found plenty, if I squinted. This is how normalization works. It doesn't demand your consent outright. It erodes your confidence in your own perception until consent feels unnecessary. In social settings, I noticed how often others spoke for me. Not out of rudeness, but habit. "She won't mind. She prefers it this way. She's not up for that." Statements delivered casually, confidently, as if they'd been confirmed. I would smile, sometimes nod, sometimes offer a mild correction that went largely unnoticed. And each time I did, the effort it took to assert myself felt slightly heavier, like swimming against a current that wasn't strong, just constant. What troubled me most was how quickly I began to internalize their expectations. I stopped volunteering opinions unless I was sure they'd be received well. I softened my language preemptively. I framed preferences as suggestions, boundaries as flexibility. I learned to anticipate what others wanted from me and deliver it efficiently, quietly, without friction. This wasn't self-erasure born of fear, it was an adaptation, a skill I'd honed over the years. I told myself I was being strategic, emotionally intelligent, and considerate. But there was a cost. The more I adapted, the more invisible my resistance became. And the less resistance people encountered, the more confident they grew in their assumptions about me. At work, this translated into being passed over for decisions that affected my responsibilities. Not because I lacked competence, but because I was seen as someone who preferred to focus on execution. I was praised for my reliability while being excluded from influence. At home, it meant my emotional landscape was increasingly summarized by someone else. My quiet was labeled withdrawal, my independence, stress, my boundaries, fragility. I remember a moment that crystallized this for me. We were at a small gathering, nothing formal. Someone asked me a direct question about a future plan, one I hadn't made yet. I opened my mouth to answer, and my spouse spoke first. "We're taking it one step at a time," he said. "She doesn't need the pressure." The room nodded, the conversation moved on. I sat there, unchallenged, unheard, feeling a strange mix of disbelief and clarity. Not anger, not sadness, just awareness. This was no longer a misunderstanding. It was a system where my silence was interpreted as agreement, my calm as incapacity, and my adaptability as permission. A system reinforced not by cruelty, but by comfort, everyone else's. And the most unsettling realization of all was this. I had helped build it by staying quiet long enough that others forgot how to ask. By the time I noticed the disrespect for what it was, it had already been normalized. And undoing something that feels normal to everyone else requires more than speaking up once. Roles don't arrive announced. No one sits you down and explains what you're expected to become. They form quietly, through repetition, through what's rewarded and what's ignored, through the space you're allowed to occupy without resistance. By the time I recognized mine, it was already well rehearsed. I was the reliable one, the reasonable one, the person who would understand. That word followed me everywhere, said with affection and relief, as if my greatest contribution was making things easier for everyone else. "She'll understand," my spouse would say, when a plan changed last minute. "You're so understanding," friends told me, when I swallowed a disappointment with a smile. "We knew you'd be flexible," colleagues added, when decisions were finalized without my input. Understanding became my assigned function. And once you're assigned a function, people stop imagining you might want something different. I began to see how narrow the space was that I was allowed to occupy. I could be calm, but not firm. Thoughtful, but not decisive. Insightful, but not insistent. Any step outside that frame triggered immediate concern. When I asserted a preference clearly, the reaction wasn't resistance, it was alarm. "Are you okay? This doesn't sound like you. You don't have to push yourself." As if clarity were a symptom. As if self-definition required explanation. It became clear that my value, in their eyes, was tied to predictability. I was useful because I didn't disrupt. Dependable because I didn't demand. Safe because I didn't challenge. The role required maintenance, and I was the one maintaining it, even as it constrained me. At home, this role translated into a quiet hierarchy I hadn't agreed to. My spouse took on the position of interpreter, of my moods, my limits, my needs. He wasn't cruel about it. He genuinely believed he was being attentive. But attention, when it stops listening, turns into authorship. He would tell others what I could handle. He would decide when I needed rest. He would frame my silence as evidence, not choice. And because I didn't counter him forcefully, his version of me gained authority. I started noticing how often conversations about my life happened without me. Not secretly, openly, as if my presence was optional because the conclusion was already known. I was being managed, not aggressively, not consciously, but thoroughly. What made this difficult to confront was the moral packaging. Everything was justified as care, as support, as protection, and refusing protection, especially as a woman who was already labelled quiet, felt socially dangerous. It risked recasting me as ungrateful, unstable, or in denial. So I complied outwardly. I nodded. I smiled. I played the part assigned to me with the same competence I'd brought to every other responsibility. But internally, something shifted. I began to understand that this role wasn't neutral. It wasn't just a misunderstanding that would resolve itself with time. It was a position others benefited from, a version of me that required less effort, less negotiation, less respect. And I saw, with uncomfortable clarity, how difficult it would be to leave that role without consequences. Because when people build their comfort around who they think you are, any attempt to redefine yourself feels like a disruption to them, even if it's a correction for you. That was the moment I stopped thinking of this as a series of awkward interactions. It was a structure, and I was standing exactly where I'd been placed. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no confrontation, no raised voice, no moment where someone crossed a line so clearly that I had to respond. It happened on a morning that looked like every other morning. I was standing at the kitchen sink, rinsing a mug I hadn't finished. The light was soft, the house quiet. My spouse was behind me, speaking in that familiar, careful tone he'd adopted over the past months. "I think today should be a low-demand day for you," he said. "You seemed off yesterday." There it was again. A statement, not a question. I turned slightly, still holding the mug. "Off how?" He hesitated, searching, not for evidence, but for language that would sound reasonable. "Just not yourself." Something in me paused. Not flared, not hardened, just paused. I realized in that stillness that I no longer knew what myself meant to him, or to anyone else, for that matter. The version of me they were responding to was no longer one I recognized. "I was quiet," I said. My voice was even. "That's all." He nodded, but his eyes carried that same look I'd seen before. Concern layered over certainty. "That's what worries me." And for the first time, I didn't absorb the statement. I didn't soften it. I didn't translate it into something easier to live with. I just let it exist. He went on talking, outlining the day he thought would be best for me. Fewer tasks, no meetings, time to rest. His words floated past me, but my attention had turned inward. I noticed how calm I felt. Not resigned, not numb. Clear. It occurred to me then, quietly, unmistakably, that my internal state no longer belonged to me in this relationship. That my silence, my calm, my steadiness had been reclassified as symptoms without my consent. And if that was true, then anything I did or didn't do could be interpreted against me. That realization didn't frighten me. It clarified me. I finished rinsing the mug and set it down. "I'm going to work as planned today," I said. "I'll see you later." He looked surprised, not angry, just unsettled. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I just don't want you pushing yourself." "I'm sure," I replied. That was all. No explanation, no defense. I left the house and felt something unfamiliar accompany me. Not adrenaline, not defiance, but alignment. For the first time in a long while, my external actions matched my internal truth without negotiation. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. I worked. I spoke when I needed to. I stayed quiet when I chose to. Nothing dramatic happened. And yet everything had changed, because that morning marked the first time I noticed the gap between how I was being perceived and who I actually was, and chose not to bridge it for someone else's comfort. I didn't confront the narrative forming around me. I didn't argue with it. I didn't try to dismantle it in that moment. I simply stopped participating in it. That decision didn't show on the surface. Anyone watching would have seen the same composed woman going about her day, but internally, a boundary had formed, clean, precise, and non-negotiable. I began to observe instead of absorb. When concern was expressed, I noted its framing. When assumptions were made, I registered their confidence. When my words were summarized, I remembered the original version. I stopped correcting people reflexively. Not out of fear, but out of curiosity. I wanted to understand how deep the misunderstanding ran and who benefited from it. That day, something fundamental shifted. Silence stopped being a habit and became a choice. And once silence is chosen consciously, it becomes a form of agency. I didn't know yet where this shift would lead. I hadn't formed a plan. I wasn't plotting an exit or preparing a confrontation. I was simply no longer available to be defined without my involvement. That morning at the sink didn't look like a turning point. There was no dramatic soundtrack, no internal monologue declaring independence. Just a woman noticing, with sudden clarity, that the quiet she carried was being used against her, and deciding calmly to take it back. Once I noticed the difference between being quiet and being silent by default, I couldn't unsee it. Before, my silence had been automatic, a reflex shaped by years of smoothing edges and keeping things comfortable. Now it was deliberate, measured, observant. And that change, though invisible, altered everything. I stopped volunteering explanations. When someone asked how I was feeling, I answered honestly but briefly. Fine. Focused. Tired like anyone else. I didn't elaborate unless I was asked directly, and even then, I stayed close to facts. No emotional translations. No preemptive reassurance. People found this unsettling. I could see it in the slight pauses that followed my responses, in the way conversations stalled, as if they were waiting for the softer version of me to reappear. the one who filled gaps and made things easier to interpret. At home, my spouse noticed the change almost immediately. "You've been really quiet lately," he said one evening. "I've always been quiet," I replied. He frowned. "Not like this." That distinction interested me. Not like this meant not performing, not smoothing, not accommodating the story he'd been telling himself about me. Still, I didn't challenge him. I didn't argue about tone or intent. I simply let the discomfort sit where it belonged, with him. Silence, when it's no longer automatic, becomes a mirror. It reflects people back to themselves, and not everyone likes what they see. Others began misreading my restraint as withdrawal, as a weakness, as compliance. They assumed my lack of visible reaction meant agreement, exhaustion, or confusion. In a strange way, this worked in my favor. Because when people underestimate you, they stop guarding their assumptions. I listened. I noticed how often my spouse spoke for me when he felt unsure. How quickly he reached for professional language, stress, burnout, concern, when my behavior didn't match his expectations. How his care had begun to lean on authority rather than intimacy. And I noticed how little effort anyone made to verify their conclusions. The less I explained, the more confident others became in their interpretations. It was as if my silence invited projection, and they accepted the invitation eagerly. I kept a mental record, not emotionally, but precisely. Who spoke on my behalf? What language did they use? When concern replaced curiosity, how often were they framed as protection? I didn't confront any of it. This wasn't avoidance. It was information gathering. There's a particular kind of power in being underestimated while fully aware of it. You see the structure clearly because you're no longer inside it, trying to justify your position. You can trace the lines of influence, the assumptions holding everything up. And once you see that structure, you realize something else. Disrupting it loudly isn't always the most effective move. People expect resistance to look like noise. They prepare for arguments, not for absence. They anticipate tears, not stillness. They're ready to defend their intentions, but not to examine them. My silence, chosen consciously, allowed others to reveal their confidence in a story that wasn't true. And confidence, when misplaced, is fragile. I didn't yet know what I would do with what I was learning. I only knew that reacting prematurely would collapse the clarity I'd gained. So I waited. I observed. I stayed calm. From the outside, nothing had changed. From the inside, I had stopped being passive. Silence had become a position, not an omission, but a stance. And in that space, preparation quietly began. Preparation doesn't announce itself. It doesn't look like defiance or resolve. Most of the time, it looks like routine. That's why no one noticed when mine began. Outwardly, I remained exactly as I had been. Calm, composed, cooperative. I went to work. I came home. I participated just enough to avoid drawing attention. The role I'd been assigned gave me cover. No one expects strategic thinking from someone they believe is fragile. Internally, I became meticulous. I started by paying attention to language, not what people felt, but what they said. The words chosen when they believed they were being careful. The phrases that repeated themselves: concerned, support, best for you, and just in case. These weren't emotional expressions, they were procedural. That mattered, because procedures leave trails. I began documenting, not in a dramatic way. No hidden cameras, no secret recordings, just dates, context, who said what and when. Emails are archived instead of skimmed, messages are saved instead of deleted, notes written after conversations that felt slightly off, even if I couldn't articulate why yet. I treated my own life like a case study. At the same time, I educated myself quietly about medical consent, about what constitutes evaluation versus treatment, about how easily concern can be formalized if it's framed correctly, and how difficult it is to reverse once it is. I didn't do this out of paranoia. I did it because patterns were emerging, and patterns deserve to be understood. I noticed, for example, how often my spouse referenced professionals in abstract terms. Maybe we should talk to someone. It might help to get an outside perspective. They'd probably say the same thing. The language was always hypothetical, non-threatening, but it positioned authority just beyond the horizon, ready to be invoked if needed. I also noticed how my own words were increasingly being summarized rather than quoted when shared with others. Paraphrased into something softer, more concerning, more actionable. That's when I stopped speaking casually about anything that could be misinterpreted. I became precise. If I was tired, I said I hadn't slept well. If I was upset, I named the cause directly. If I needed space, I specified the duration. No metaphors, no ambiguity. This wasn't self-censorship. It was control of narrative. I understood now that vagueness could be repurposed. Precision could not. I also began separating my internal life from my shared life. Not emotionally, logistically. I reviewed documents I hadn't looked at in years. I made copies of things I'd previously trusted were handled. I ensured access where I'd assumed access existed. None of this looked suspicious. It looked like an organization, like responsibility, like the same reliable person I'd always been. And because I wasn't acting afraid, no one thought to ask why I was suddenly so thorough. What they didn't notice was how I was positioning myself. I reduced dependency quietly. I clarified ownership without announcing it. I ensured that my autonomy wasn't theoretical. Most importantly, I stopped assuming good intentions were enough to protect me. That was the hardest adjustment. Not emotionally, but philosophically. Accepting that someone could care about me and still make decisions that harmed me if left unchecked. That love, without respect for agency, becomes something else entirely. I didn't confront my spouse with these realizations. There was no benefit in doing so. He still believed he was acting out of care. And as long as he believed that, he felt justified. Justification is powerful. It makes people bold. I let him be bold. Because boldness, when unexamined, creates records, statements, actions taken with confidence instead of caution. And confidence leaves evidence. By the time others began to feel certain that they understood me, I understood them far better. I knew who spoke with authority, who deferred without thinking, who documented, and who didn't. And I knew, with increasing clarity, where the leverage would come from if I ever needed it. There was no satisfaction in this knowledge, no thrill, just a steady sense of readiness. They thought nothing was happening. That was the point. The reveal didn't come with shock or triumph. There was no rush of adrenaline, no moment where I sat back and thought, I've got it. What arrived instead was a quiet, unmistakable clarity, like finally seeing the full outline of something that had been taking shape in the dark. It happened late one evening, long after my spouse had gone to bed. I was sitting alone at the dining table with my laptop open, reviewing documents I'd already read once before. This time, I wasn't reading them as reassurance. I was reading them as evidence. I noticed a discrepancy first. Small, almost invisible. A timeline that didn't quite line up with how events had been described to me. A consultation mentioned casually in conversation that appeared on paper as something more formal. Not action yet, but intent. I followed that thread carefully. One email led to another. One reference unlocked context. What emerged wasn't a conspiracy, but it was a plan. Loosely structured, framed as care, and already partially in motion. What struck me most wasn't the scale of it. It was the assumption underneath it. The assumption that I wouldn't resist, that I wouldn't question, that I wouldn't recognize what was happening until it was already decided. I saw clearly how concern had been translated into process, how my silence had been interpreted as instability, how my spouse's confidence in his understanding of me had given him the certainty to act on my behalf. And suddenly, a sentence he'd repeated often over the past months took on a new weight. I just want what's best for you. What he meant was, what I believe is best for you. That distinction matters. I leaned back in my chair and let the information settle. Not emotionally, logically. I asked myself one question, and only one. If I do nothing, what happens next? The answer was unambiguous. Others would step in. Professionals would be consulted. Decisions would be framed as urgent, necessary, and protective. And because I had already been positioned as someone whose own account was unreliable, my objections, if I raised them too late, would be treated as further evidence. That was the moment I understood the leverage. Not leverage over my spouse, but over the situation itself. I had documentation, I had timelines, I had consistency, something narratives built on assumptions rarely survive. And most importantly, I had not reacted emotionally at any point along the way. There were no outbursts to reinterpret, no statements made in anger, no instability to point to. I had been calm, precise, predictable in the best possible way. That mattered more than anything else. I didn't feel relieved. I didn't feel vindicated. What I felt was sober, because leverage doesn't mean power over someone. It means responsibility for what happens next. I understood then that I was standing at a threshold. One path involved confrontation, naming what I'd found, demanding explanations, forcing the issue into the open immediately. The other involved restraint, allowing events to continue just far enough that the structure revealed itself fully, without me having to speculate or accuse. I chose restraint, not because I wanted to trap anyone, but because I wanted the truth to stand on its own, without my emotions attached to it. That night, I didn't sleep much. Not because I was anxious, but because my mind was steady and alert, replaying scenarios with clinical distance. I mapped outcomes, I considered timing. I thought carefully about what not to do. I didn't pack a bag, I didn't confront my spouse, I didn't change my behavior outwardly at all. The most important thing was continuity. People who believe they're acting benevolently often grow careless. They don't anticipate scrutiny from the person they're helping. They assume gratitude or compliance, not documentation. I let that assumption stand. By morning, nothing had changed on the surface. My spouse kissed my cheek, asked how I'd slept, and reminded me to take the day slowly. I responded as I always had, calm, neutral, unremarkable. But inside, the situation was no longer ambiguous. I knew exactly what was happening. And I knew that when the moment came, because it would come, it wouldn't be chaos that decided the outcome. It would be preparation. Once clarity arrives, indecision becomes a choice of its own. I spent the next few days moving through my life with an unusual steadiness, because nothing was wrong, but because everything was suddenly defined. Ambiguity had been replaced by options, and options require evaluation. There were several paths open to me. I could confront my spouse immediately, lay out what I'd found, demand explanations, insist on being heard. That approach would have felt righteous, even relieving. It also would have shifted the focus away from the structure forming around me and onto my reaction to it. Emotion, once introduced, becomes the headline. I could leave quietly, remove myself from the situation before anything formalized, pack a bag, stay with a friend, create distance. That would have protected me in the short term, but it would have confirmed the narrative already taking shape. Absence, in this context, would be interpreted as instability, not autonomy. I could do nothing. Trust that care would remain care, that concern would not cross into control, that my intentions would eventually be understood if I stayed patient long enough. That option was the most dangerous of all, because inaction, when others are already acting on your behalf, isn't neutrality. It's consent by default. So I considered the final option, the one that didn't involve confrontation or escape, but preparation for an outcome others believed they were orchestrating alone. I decided to let events move forward just enough to expose their assumptions. This wasn't passive, it was deliberate. I understood that once professionals became involved, the language would shift. Observations would become records, opinions would become recommendations, and the moment authority entered the room, whoever appeared most composed, most consistent, most documented would be believed. I intended to be that person. From that point on, I treated every interaction as potentially consequential. Not with fear, but with precision. I answered questions accurately and briefly. I didn't speculate. I didn't volunteer emotion. I didn't contradict myself. When my spouse expressed concern, I acknowledged it without agreeing to its premise. "I hear that you're worried," I said, instead of, "I understand why you're worried." One acknowledges emotion, the other validates the interpretation. When he suggested we talk to someone, I didn't refuse. I asked who, when, and why, calmly, neutrally, as if discussing logistics. Because logistics are harder to manipulate than feelings. I also made sure my own support network knew where I stood, not emotionally, but factually. I shared my schedule, my plans, my intentions, nothing dramatic, just clarity. The goal wasn't to create allies, it was to establish continuity, a consistent version of me across contexts, so no single narrative could overwrite it. I knew by then that something was coming. The certainty in my spouse's tone had grown. Concern had hardened into resolve. He believed he was doing the right thing, and people acting from that belief rarely paused to reassess. What surprised me was how calm I felt about it. Not detached, not numb, prepared. I often think about the difference between being powerless and appearing powerless. I had been mistaken for the latter for so long that people assumed the former was true. That assumption would be tested. The night before everything shifted, my spouse sat across from me at the dining table. His hands were folded, his voice was careful. "I've been really worried about you," he said. "I think we need to take some steps, just to be safe." I looked at him and nodded once. "Okay," I said. "What steps?" He seemed relieved, almost grateful, as if my calm agreement confirmed everything he believed about me. He outlined his plan in broad strokes: concern, evaluation, support. Words chosen to sound reasonable, even benevolent. I listened without interruption. I asked one clarifying question at the end. "Will this be voluntary?" He hesitated. "It's better if we keep an open mind." That was my answer. I didn't argue. I didn't object. I didn't raise my voice or accuse him of anything. I thanked him for explaining and told him I needed some air. I went for a walk and felt the decision settle fully into place. This was no longer about misunderstanding. It was about authorship. Someone else was prepared to define my reality for me and believed I would comply quietly. I had already decided that I would not. Not with resistance, not with escape, but with presence. I would let the moment arrive. Once the decision was made, everything became quieter. Not externally, but internally. The noise of uncertainty disappeared, replaced by a narrow focus on execution. This was the phase no one ever notices, because it looks like compliance. I didn't challenge my spouse's concern. I didn't warn anyone about what I suspected was coming. I didn't rush. I understood that urgency would work against me. People who believe they are helping often move fastest when they sense resistance. Calm slows them down. Calm invites overconfidence. So I stayed calm. I began with logistics, the kind that rarely raise alarms. I reviewed financial access, not to drain or hide anything, but to ensure transparency worked in both directions. I confirmed what required joint authorization and what didn't. I made copies of documents that I'd previously trusted were handled, not to weaponize them, but to ensure I wasn't dependent on someone else's version of my own life. I updated passwords quietly, nothing dramatic, just enough to ensure privacy where privacy was appropriate. I also scheduled my own appointments, routine, visible, unremarkable. Primary care, dental, work check-ins. Normalcy creates context. Context is protection. I made sure my calendar reflected a consistent, functioning adult life. Meetings kept, deadlines met, emails answered clearly and professionally, no erratic changes, no emotional absences. At the same time, I minimized conversations that could be misinterpreted. I didn't vent. I didn't speculate. I didn't express fear or suspicion out loud. I knew that anything I said could be reframed later, stripped of nuance, and reinserted as evidence. So I spoke in facts. "I'll be home at 6. I have a meeting tomorrow morning. I'm feeling fine." Not defensive, not performative, just accurate. My spouse grew more decisive during this time. I could feel it. Concern had fully transitioned into resolve. He was preparing for something he believed was necessary and inevitable. That belief made him careless. He started coordinating without realizing how much he was revealing. Mentioning dates, referencing conversations, letting slip who had been contacted and when. Each detail fit neatly into the timeline I'd already built. I said nothing. I also made one deliberate choice that surprised even me. I packed nothing. No emergency bag, no overnight essentials, no symbolic gesture of readiness, because leaving, even temporarily, would have reinforced the narrative that I was unstable or unsafe at home. Instead, I made my presence undeniable. I slept normally, ate regularly, went to work, came home, lived my life with quiet consistency, the kind that looks boring from the outside and solid from the inside. This wasn't about proving wellness, it was about refusing to perform distress. There's a misconception that preparation always looks like action. Sometimes it looks like restraint so disciplined it borders on invisible. I let the structure around me complete itself, because once people believe they're in control, they stop anticipating resistance. They stop imagining alternate outcomes. They plan as if compliance is guaranteed. That's when systems reveal their weakest points. I noticed my spouse rehearsing explanations, not for me, but for others. Practicing concern, practicing justification, practicing how to sound reasonable if questioned. He didn't rehearse responses to resistance. He didn't prepare for refusal. He assumed my silence meant surrender. It didn't. It meant timing. I remember one evening clearly. We were sitting in the living room, the television on, but neither of us watching. He glanced at me, studying my expression. "You seem calm," he said. "I am," I replied. He nodded, as if that confirmed something for him. I realized then how deeply he misunderstood calmness. To him, calm meant acquiescence, peace, agreement. He had no idea that calm, when chosen consciously, is often the final stage before irreversible action. That night, I went to bed at my usual time. I slept deeply. By then, all the pieces were in place. No one suspected I was preparing for anything at all. The first consequence wasn't loud. It didn't arrive with confrontation or raised voices. It arrived as a subtle shift in the air, an unease that didn't yet know its own name. People around me began reacting to an absence they couldn't identify. At work, colleagues checked in more often, not because I was faltering, but because I wasn't overcompensating anymore. I did my job cleanly and on time, without the extra emotional labor I used to provide. No buffering, no smoothing, no anticipatory reassurance. They felt the loss before they understood it. At home, my spouse grew restless. He had expected gratitude, or at least visible compliance. Instead, he encountered neutrality. My calm didn't reassure him anymore. It unsettled him. "You don't seem scared," he said one night, trying to sound casual. "Why would I be?" I asked. He didn't answer. That's when I noticed the first crack in his certainty. No doubt. Confusion. The kind that arises when a plan depends on someone behaving a certain way, and they simply don't. Still, the process continued. Calls were made, appointments were scheduled, language became more official. I could feel the shift in how I was being referenced, less as a partner, more as a subject. My spouse began speaking in summaries instead of conversations. "She's been under a lot of strain. She doesn't really see it herself. We just want to be proactive." The phrases were familiar by now, but something had changed. They no longer landed the way they were meant to. Because when you're calm and present, other people's urgency starts to look disproportionate. Friends who had accepted the earlier narrative began hesitating, not openly questioning, but pausing, asking follow-up questions, looking at me instead of past me. They were noticing the mismatch between what they were being told and what they were observing. And that mismatch made them uncomfortable. My spouse sensed it too. He became more insistent, less gentle, not aggressive, just firmer. He needed momentum, he needed alignment, and he was losing both. That's when the framing escalated. What had once been concern became a coordinated moment, a gathering, a conversation with a name, an intervention. Not the dramatic kind people imagine, with shouting and tears. This one was calm, structured, polite, and carefully arranged to appear supportive rather than confrontational. Later, when I would finally have language for it, I would think of it simply as this. My spouse staged an intervention to have me committed. At the time, it arrived disguised as care. The bags were packed before the doctor even arrived. Not by me. That detail matters. When I saw them, neatly arranged, practical, unmistakably prepared, I felt something close to grief. Not for the marriage, not even for the betrayal, but for the assumption embedded in the act. The assumption that my absence was already decided, that I would go quietly, that I would accept the interpretation offered to me, that my role was to comply while others explained my life for me. What followed wasn't chaos, it was a procedure. Introductions, reassurances, calm voices explaining what would happen next. People speaking slowly, kindly, as if volume and tone could replace consent. And throughout it all, I remained exactly as I had been. Calm, coherent, oriented, present. I answered questions directly. I corrected inaccuracies without emotion. I asked for clarification when statements were vague. I did not argue. I did not plead. I did not raise my voice. I watched with a strange detachment as the momentum began to falter. Because procedures rely on compliance, and narratives rely on contrast. Without distress to point to, without resistance to reframe as instability, the structure they'd built began to wobble. Concern met consistency. Authority met documentation. Assumption met reality. I could see it in the professionals' faces, the subtle recalibration, the way they shifted from listening about me to listening to me. And I could see it in my spouse's posture as he realized, too late, that the version of me he'd been describing did not align with the woman sitting calmly in front of him. The consequence wasn't immediate collapse. It was something quieter. The realization that the process could no longer move forward as planned. That certainty had been misplaced, and that once authority begins to question its own assumptions, it doesn't recover quickly. This wasn't the end, but it was the beginning of something unraveling, slowly, irreversibly. Once doubt enters a system built on certainty, it spreads quietly, but relentlessly. What followed the intervention wasn't confrontation, it was hesitation. The doctor asked more questions than expected. Not because I demanded it, but because my answers required it. They were clear, consistent, grounded in observable reality. I didn't minimize or dramatize anything. I didn't resist the process. I participated in it on my own terms. That distinction mattered. I watched the shift happen in real time. The subtle change in posture. The way the doctor stopped looking at my spouse for confirmation and started addressing me directly. The way notes were adjusted, clarifications requested. Concern, when unsupported by evidence, begins to lose its authority. My spouse noticed it too. His voice grew tighter, his explanations longer. He began filling silences that hadn't existed before, offering interpretations where none were asked for. The calm confidence he'd rehearsed gave way to urgency. "I just don't want her to fall apart later," he said at one point. "I've seen the signs," he added quickly. The doctor nodded, but slowly, carefully. The nod of someone listening, not agreeing. I said nothing until I was addressed directly. When I spoke, I did not contradict my spouse emotionally. I didn't accuse him of misrepresentation. I simply described my life as it was. My routines, my work, my relationships, my internal state, without qualifiers or apologies. And because I had been consistent for weeks, nothing I said contradicted anything else on record. That was when the questions changed. They became specific. They became procedural. They became cautious. The momentum my spouse had relied on, forward motion driven by concern, stalled. You could feel it. Afterward, when the professionals left to review next steps, my spouse turned to me with a look I hadn't seen before. Not anger, not concerned, panic. "This wasn't supposed to go like this," he said too quickly. I looked at him calmly. "What did you expect?" He opened his mouth, then closed it. The answer hovered there, unspoken, because saying it out loud would have required admitting something he wasn't ready to face, that he had assumed I wouldn't be heard, that he had planned for compliance, not contradiction, that he had mistaken my quiet for incapacity. Over the next few days, everything slowed. Calls were returned later. Follow-ups were framed as optional. Language softened again, but this time toward neutrality, not protection. The process that had once felt inevitable now required consent at every step. Consent I did not give. My spouse tried to recalibrate. He apologized, but vaguely. For stress, for things getting out of hand. He suggested we move forward together. Reset. Forget how close things had come. But something fundamental had already broken. Trust doesn't shatter loudly. Sometimes it dissolves. I saw him struggling to regain control of a narrative that no longer belonged to him. The more he tried to reassert concern, the more it sounded like justification. It was too late to fix it. Not because I was unforgiving, but because the line had already been crossed. He had acted on an assumption about my agency, and once an agency is challenged, it doesn't return to its original state. I wasn't angry. That surprised him. I was resolved. I began disentangling quietly. Not in secret, just without announcement. Conversations shifted from emotional repair to logistics, from we to I. He sensed it and panicked further. "We can talk to someone," he said. "We can slow down. We don't have to make any decisions right now." But the decision had already been made, not in a dramatic moment, but over weeks of observation, preparation, and clarity. What he didn't understand was that the intervention hadn't failed because I resisted it. It failed because it exposed something neither of us could unsee. And once you see how easily someone is willing to override your reality for your own good, there is no version of the relationship that returns you to safety. The structure that had been built around me was gone. But so was the marriage that made it possible. The confrontation, when it finally came, was almost disappointingly quiet. There was no explosion, no accusations hurled across the room, no list of grievances was delivered with shaking hands. By the time we sat down to talk, really talk, most of the emotional energy had already burned itself out in private. What remained was clarity. We were sitting at the same dining table where so many careful conversations had happened before. The difference now was that nothing needed to be managed. There was no outcome I was trying to protect. No version of myself I needed him to accept. He spoke first. I was scared, he said. I thought I was doing the right thing. I know, I replied. That was true. I never doubted that he believed in his own intentions. What I doubted, and no longer accepted, was his authority to act on them without me. You shut me out, he continued. You didn't tell me what you were thinking. I met his eyes. You stopped asking. That landed harder than anything louder might have. He tried to explain, to contextualize, to point to moments he'd interpreted as warning signs. I listened without interruption. Not because I agreed, but because I wanted him to finish without feeling attacked. This wasn't a trial. It was a closing statement. When he was done, I spoke slowly. You decided who I was without checking if it was true, I said. And then you acted on that decision. He shook his head. I was trying to protect you. You were trying to manage me, I said gently. There's a difference. Silence followed. Not the awkward kind, the final kind. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't catalogue every misstep. I didn't need to. The single fact was sufficient. He had prepared for my removal from my own life without my consent. That truth didn't require embellishment. I don't hate you, I said, but I don't feel safe being defined by you anymore. That was the moment it ended. Not legally, not yet. Not logistically, but relationally. The marriage, as it had existed, could not survive that sentence. He asked if there was anything he could do. I thought carefully before answering. No, I said. Not now! And that was honest too, because repair requires a shared reality. And we no longer had one. I stood up, not dramatically, just deliberately. The conversation was complete. There was nothing left to negotiate. What struck me most afterward wasn't relief or sadness, but a profound absence of noise. No racing thoughts, no second guessing, just stillness. For the first time in a long while, my quiet belonged to me again. After everything settled, after the conversations, the paperwork, the quiet disentangling, I expected to feel something dramatic. Freedom, maybe, or grief, or anger that had been delayed and was finally ready to surface. What I felt instead was spaciousness. Not emptiness, space. The kind that appears when you are no longer compressing yourself to fit someone else's interpretation. My life didn't change overnight in obvious ways. I still woke up early, still drank coffee from the same mug, still went to work, answered emails, and lived inside ordinary days. From the outside, it probably looked like very little had happened. But internally, the shift was profound. For the first time, I wasn't being monitored through someone else's concern. I wasn't calibrating my tone to avoid being misread. I wasn't pre-editing my feelings in case they were interpreted as symptoms. I spoke when I wanted to. I stayed quiet when I chose to. And no one translated either state into something it wasn't. I noticed how my body responded to that freedom before my mind did. My shoulders settled. My sleep deepened. Decisions became simpler, not because life was easier, but because they were finally mine. I didn't reinvent myself. I didn't need to. I was still calm, still reflective, still someone who prefers precision over noise. The difference was that these traits were no longer available for reinterpretation without my consent. I also became more selective. Not guarded. Clear. I paid attention to how people responded when I set boundaries without explanation. Who respected them immediately, who pushed, who framed my clarity as coldness or distance. Those reactions told me everything I needed to know. I learned that quiet strength doesn't require correction or defense. It reveals itself through consistency, through the refusal to perform distress in order to be believed. There is a particular dignity in that. I don't tell this story because I see myself as a victim. I don't even tell it because I see myself as someone who won. That framing misses the point. What I reclaimed wasn't power over anyone else. It was authorship. The right to define my own inner life, the right to be calm without being managed, the right to be quiet without being erased. I understand now how easily care can turn into control when it's not paired with respect, and how important it is to notice the difference early, before decisions are made in your name. I don't carry bitterness. That surprised me. Bitterness requires rumination, and I no longer need to rehearse what happened to justify how I feel. The truth stands on its own. I lived it. I understood it. I acted on it. That's enough. If there's one thing I hold on to now, it's this. Silence is not the absence of strength. In the right hands, it's its purest expression. And I am no longer afraid of how quiet I am. When I look back on everything now, what stands out isn't the intervention itself, or even the moment it failed. What stays with me is how ordinary the path to that moment was. There was no villain twirling intent, no sudden cruelty, just a series of small assumptions layered on top of each other, each one reasonable on its own, each one left unexamined long enough to become dangerous. That's how most people lose agency. Not through force, but through familiarity, through being known as something instead of being known by someone. For a long time, I believed that staying calm was the same as staying safe, that being understanding would protect me, that if my intentions were good, they would be recognized eventually. I know now that calmness without boundaries invites authorship by others, and understanding, when it becomes a role you're expected to play, can be used to silence you. The most important lesson I took from this experience is not about marriage or mental health or even betrayal. It's about authorship. Who gets to define your inner life? Who gets to speak for you when you're present? And what happens when you don't challenge that? Not because you agree, but because you don't want to make things uncomfortable. Quiet dominance doesn't look like control. It looks like alignment, like knowing exactly where you stand and refusing to be moved from it by someone else's certainty. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't punish anyone. I didn't dramatize my pain to be believed. I simply stayed present long enough for the truth to become undeniable. And when it did, I chose myself. Not loudly, not cruelly, but completely. If you're listening to this and recognizing pieces of yourself in it, if you've ever been described instead of consulted, managed instead of trusted, or protected in ways that felt like erasure, I want you to know this. You don't need to prove your strength by becoming louder. You don't need to perform distress to justify your boundaries, and you don't need permission to reclaim authorship over your own life. Sometimes the most irreversible decision you'll ever make is the quiet one, to stop participating in a version of yourself that others find convenient. If this story resonated with you, I'd like to hear your thoughts. Have you ever realized that someone else was telling your story for you? And if so, what did you do when you noticed? I'll be reading the comments. Thank you for staying with me.
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.